Good afternoon and welcome to Humanities Montana's virtual panel on the Native vote in Montana. My name is Randy Tanglin and I'm the Executive Director of Humanities Montana. This is the third in a four-part virtual panel series on our Why It Matters initiative on civic and electoral participation. Humanities Montana, of course, is a nonpartisan organization. But in our conversations with Montanans all around the state, we at Humanities Montana have found that there is a real hunger for the context and multiple diverse viewpoints the humanities can bring the pressing issues of the day. We also hear Montanans express a desire for healthy, respectful, and civil discourse, and we believe that this is possible. So today we bring you three different voices of experience and expertise to explore the nuances of the Native vote in Montana. And I want to thank our three panelists and our moderator in advance for the conversation and insight that they'll offer us this afternoon. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for being a part of Humanities Montana and our Why It Matters initiative. I'll now turn things over to our program officer, Samantha Dwyer, who will tell you what to expect from the Zoom panel and introduce our panelists.
Hello, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us. We're so excited to see such a great crowd for our third Why It Matters panel. This program was funded by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We are committed to informed and civil dialogue from different perspectives. We are happy to see so many people throughout this series with the same goals. This afternoon's program will be a conversation with three panelists, Marci McLean-Pollock, Lauri Kindness, and Jason Begay, moderated by Amy Martin. Marci is Executive Director of Montana Native Vote, an organization that provides resources and training for Native American communities to engage in the legislative process at state and federal levels. She grew up on the Blackfeet Nation in Montana and says her passion is helping others to find their voice and build their leadership skills to lead movements and change. Lauri is an enrolled Crow tribal member from Lodgegrass, Montana on the Crow Reservation, where she was born and raised. Lauri spent 13 years as an active duty service member in the United States Army. She is a paratrooper and has had 5 overseas tours. Lauri is actively engaged as a community organizer with Western Native Voice, participating in public comment for Montana legislation on bills on behalf of Native American concerns. Jason is Associate Professor and Director of Native American Journalism Projects at the University of Montana's School of Journalism. He teaches courses in reporting and diversity and co-teaches the school's award-winning Native News Project. Before coming to the University of Montana, he worked for the New York Times, Portland's Oregonian, and the Navajo Times. He has also served on the board of directors for the Native American Journalists Association. Our moderator for the conversation with these three panelists is Amy Martin. Amy is a journalist and the host of Threshold, a public radio show and podcast that investigates pressing environmental issues in depth. In 2016-17, Amy was a Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado. We are grateful for her thoughtful moderation of these panels, and I am happy to turn to her now for the rest of this conversation.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone for being here. It's great to see the turnout and so grateful to our panelists for taking the time to share their insights with everyone today. I think I'd just like to start with what feels like, well, not just feels like, is a truly historic event that's underway right now, which is that the first Native American cabinet member has been nominated and it looks like she's on her way to being confirmed, and that's Deb Holland, of course, who's been nominated to lead the Department of the Interior. The Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee is apparently going to vote on whether or not to advance her nomination tomorrow and then to the full Senate. I have a whole bunch of Montana specific things I'd like to get into with our panelists, but of course what happens at DOI with the Department of Interior very much impacts Montana as well. And it's also just such an amazing moment to have a Native American leader elevated to this level, and especially this department. which is what Marci was saying just before we went live here. So Marci, do you want to just continue what we were talking about before the guests came in? I was really interested in your thoughts about this nomination.
What I was saying and alluding to or stating is that especially after what we've been through for the last 4 years with the Bears Ears under attack, the Badger 2 Medicine under attack, and other sacred sites, that, even up in Alaska, the ANWR, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, like there was so many things that we were and are in jeopardy of losing. To have someone like Deb Holland, a Native American Indigenous woman who, is so committed to making sure Natives are heard and listened to, and that our treaties are honored. It's just quite, timely of her to be hopefully, confirmed to that position, which does work a lot with, protecting our sacred sites and other land issues that we need to make sure that we all have clean air and clean water to drink for our grandkids and great grandkids.
Yeah. And Jason, do you want to say anything about the historical significance of her nomination to the Department of Interior in particular?
Yeah, I think having, because the Interior Department oversees IHS still, I believe, and I think having a Native American person who identifies closely with her reservation, having somebody having that experience oversee that department is going to make a huge difference. And it's also very inspiring from people on the ground level to see that kind of change happen for the first time in the country's history. I think for the most part, it inspires a lot of hope.
Yeah. Lauri, I know you were one of those people that's very much on the ground in the last election cycle. What's your response to Deb Holland's nomination?
I am just really ecstatic, and I'm praying that she does get confirmed, because we need it. This is a time in our history that we need it, and I think it would be amazing to hold space with her in history and share that part of history with the rest of the United States and the world. So I'm just really looking forward to having a Native American woman holding that position and making history.
Well, on that hopeful note, let's dive in. And Marci, I'd kind of like to start with you in terms of maybe giving us an overview to Montana issues around Native voting. What are some of the barriers to voting that are faced by Indigenous people in Montana, and what can all Montanans do to help eliminate some of those barriers?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all for inviting me to this panel and honoring and recognizing the work that not only we are doing now, but also on whose shoulders I stand. The 5 amazing women who started Montana Native Vote and Western Native Voice when they were together. Carol Juneau, Gail Small, Janine Pease, Rhonda Whiting, Jennifer Perez-Cole, Norma Bigsby, women like that who have been doing this work for a very long time. So just first of all, recognizing the work that has been done before us, I think is always important, but keep in mind that we were the first ones here, the last ones to get the right to vote. We were the last ones to become citizens. We became citizens in 1924. More or less got the right to vote in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act amendments, right? And still in the 70s, there were states that were still working to follow that. So Natives weren't always allowed to vote. And still today, we're fighting this in our state capital. In fact, right now with the restrictions on ballot pickup and delivery, with fighting for polling places on our reservations, on our tribal nations, we have distance as an issue for us, a historical mistrust of governmental entities, a historical mistrust of outsiders, also a not clearly for all of us, not clearly understanding that connection between state policy and federal policy and tribal policy. I think a lot of us myself, for instance, growing up on the Blackfeet Nation, I thought it was more important to pay attention to, not that I did a lot, but pay attention to the tribal laws that were made. And as I grew into Western Native Voice and Montana Native Vote, realized rather quickly that it's equally important to pay attention to what goes on the state level. For instance, the voting stuff, the election stuff, that is determined at the state level, and then down to the county level. So really important to pay attention to those. So that's that. And then distance, traveling. We have high rates of unemployment. We have high rates of poverty, and to expect our people to travel, like in Northern Cheyenne country, 70 miles one way from, say, Lame Deer or Bernie or some of the other communities, all the way to Forsyth, Montana, and not knowing if we want to spend our last resources or 2 or 3 hours going to take care of elections business, right? When other people like myself living in Billings, I can walk down across the street from my office and take care of my election services. So it's really that, that disparity of access to the election services. And the other thing, is the racism that we experience in these border towns. I grew up on the Blackfeet Nation, and Cut Bank, which is where I am right now, was always very racist. It's always been. I remember as a little girl going into the county office here with my elderly grandmother at the time, which wasn't something I got to do. I didn't get to travel with them very much. But we went into the county office, and there were these white folks in front of us and behind us in line, and the lady behind the counter was nice and happy and smiley and talked to the people in front of us. And my grandma got up to the counter, and the action of that woman changed drastically. The tone in her voice changed, the way she treated my grandmother changed. I remember walking around JCPenney's here in Cut Bank, and the clerks would follow us around, which still happens in Billings, Montana, to natives and other places. I can only speak about my own experiences though. So it's that also, add on that discrimination, that racism. And then just the unfamiliarity with this system. It's new to us as natives, being only, having the right to vote since 65. And so you add that newness, that, all these other barriers, and then not having the right access to what do these candidates really mean? So, I had folks tell me when I was on the ground as a community organizer, well, I don't want to vote because I don't want to vote for the wrong person. And so that's what prompted us to start doing voter guides. So we just compare the candidates side by side without giving any information on how to vote. And that makes people feel more educated and informed about their decisions they're making. And so you'll notice since the organization was started in 2012, that was the first election cycle, voter turnout has continued to increase. Every election we have had since 2012, it's historic levels of voter turnout in our tribal nations. And it's because of organizations like ours and because of the community members. Community members are seeing an ownership in voting and having their voices heard in the capitals, in the county offices, and the school boards. So it's become, I think, a groundswell of people wanting to be a part of things that really directly and drastically impact our daily lives. And the more you tell folks, well, if our vote wasn't important, they wouldn't be trying to silence it all the time. So, it's just a lot of just making it a place where we see ourselves. And I think that's one thing that's important with Deb Holland and Sharice Davids being where they are, is we now see ourselves there. Peggy Flanagan, the lieutenant governor, right? Denise Juneau, superintendent of public schools in Montana. Then all the folks that we have in the state capitol as legislators right now. So it's really seeing ourselves there, which then passes or paves the way for more of us to be there and then be in higher places.
Thank you. Yeah. And, since you touched on this, I would kind of like to get into the fact that Indigenous people in Montana and all over the country, they have two different voting systems that they have to interact with. There's the tribal system, and then there's the white system. And Jason, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, both from your own experience and from your own academic study, about how that impacts voting. To basically, you have to kind of learn two systems, understand two sets of candidates, and it isn't all as integrated into one kind of voting, place and time as it is for non-Native people, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So once again, thanks everybody for coming. And yeah, I think for Native Americans, in my experience covering tribal government for 6 years at the Navajo time specifically, I think what I noticed was that on Indian country, Native Americans tend to be very liberal at the polls, but conservative in practice for so many different reasons. There's so many different things that Native Americans have to confront and study and become familiar with. Like, I think, especially if you grew up on Indian country on a reservation, it's really easy to feel insular and kind of like, I remember growing up on Navajo Nation, like feeling like everything else was just nonsense. Everything outside the Navajo Nation border was like kind of foreign, literally foreign to me. And it took a while, like well into my 20s, to realize that like we're all part of this really big political ecosystem. And so that's one of the things where you have to confront, like we have issues facing us directly in the Navajo Nation. And then indirectly, there's like this federal system that's kind of overseeing everything. And it's kind of easy to lose sight of that, especially if you're on a reservation, if that makes sense, right? So that kind of makes it a little more difficult to engage in politics outside of your communities. I think you notice that like the political party system doesn't really play a part in tribal politics. It's just like when you're running for a tribal council, you don't run for a party. You just run for issues. That's really a federal outside reservation thing. So just kind of thinking about like, how do I address that political party system and then the system at home is two wildly different things when election day comes. So that requires a lot of preparation, and the experience is quite unique to Native Americans.
Yeah, I mean, just on the pure fact that it takes time to understand the issues, understand which candidates represent which sides of issues, and all the work that needs to do before any of us get to the polls. I kind of can't imagine having to do that in like two completely different systems simultaneously. And Lauri, I'm curious, when your work on the Crow Reservation, how are you seeing that play out, that distinction between tribal politics and non-tribal politics? Do you feel like you're is it harder to get people interested in one or the other?
I think what Jason was talking about is very similar to what goes on here at home, because we are kind of intercellular. We are within, usually just within our own community. We're very close knit and only focus on what's going on with what's going on inside internally. And so a lot of the time our focus is on what the politics that happen on the reservation is our focal point. And so with like the election season, the primaries and generals and, outside of the reservation politics, it's really kind of tough to put it into perspective for people who are living from day to day trying to survive. So, that's kind of what I try to do is encourage and educate and bring about awareness with the work that, I was given the task that I was given. So yeah, I definitely believe that it's awareness and bringing that to the forefront for the people and letting them know that, that they do have a space and a voice in the grander scheme of things, so yeah.
What do people say to you, Lauri, when you're in that role of trying to convince people in your community to register to vote or to go to the polls? Like what kinds of, what are the arguments that people might give back for like, I don't want to do this? Or do you find most people are really receptive to it? They just need to be given access? What's been your experience on the ground?
Okay, so absolutely, you're going to get, there were so many different scenarios that I faced when it came to my community. And a lot of it was just, I know one of the things that was asked is if I had a pitch, to the people. And really when it came down to it, I didn't think a pitch was as necessary of an approach as expressing, you know, relatable content to the individual in their actual moment, you know. So definitely explaining about the history, the backstory of our people, and the fight that, you know, happened from 1870 to even current, with the voting, being able to vote, being able to express yourself and being that voice. So when I was given this opportunity through Montana Native Vote as a regional organizer, for not just Crow Country, but Bighorn County, I actually took a military approach in adapting and overcoming, and, you know, amid a pandemic. And so Marci actually was, you know, the person that helped to appoint me in this position. And I kind of just basically brainstormed and started gathering where I was allowed to take on 9 additional teammates. And so August 21st is actually when I hit the ground running. Myself and another teammate in a different district decided to set up here at the Incident Command in Crow Agency. And so we came up with what I called a drive-through pop-up site, which basically, you know, we followed all policy and procedure of safety protocol. And so we, the Incident Command, this was like our trial run. They set up a food distribution point. And then so we asked, can we basically piggyback while these people wait in line? Do you mind if we approach them and ask them about, you know, if they voted, and start bringing about awareness? And so then that's when we started registering people to vote. On that weekend, we did a back-to-back weekend, and we saw that it was like very, very, it was very positive, you know, and there was a lot of positive feedback. And we had about, I think that day we visited with 145 cars. And inside those vehicles, of course, there was not just one adult, but, you know, a few. And so we were able to register a lot of tribal members. And so, you know, we basically, that's when I started thinking, okay, we have to bring this to the people. We can't expect them to come see us or seek it out. We have to go to the people. So we started going and rotating through all 6 different districts on our reservation. And it seemed like that was very, that was like what helped us in the footwork, the trenches, you know. And so it was kind of neat to see that, because we continued on all the way until election day. We helped with every issue imaginable, from resolving active voter status issues, address issues, which is always a situation, because not everybody, you know, most of us have PO boxes, you know, just getting new voter registration and interacting with the people, and just, you know, on their level, not on any other like cookie cutter, you know, pitch. It was definitely every individual, every district was different. And so we basically adapted and really interacted with the people on their level. So yeah, it was amazing. I would say even on election night alone, we did everything from handling COVID ballots, COVID exposed ballots. Of course, you know, Bighorn County Elections Office had their safety protocol in place as well, but I was the one who handled all of those ballots and made sure that, you know, we did everything that we needed to make it safe, but make it possible for the public. So, and then on election night alone, election day alone, I think we had like 150 people that we registered to vote, but a total of about 600 registrations from August 21st to November 3rd. So,
wow.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the power of having people on the ground who know the people, know the community. And Jason, I kind of wanted to talk to you about that whole issue in a little bit of a broader context. I know Native Americans played a huge role in the outcome of the 2020 election. Arizona's gotten a lot of attention, but Wisconsin and other states too. There were, you know, decisive turning points in Native American communities. I think I've got a little bit of data here. In Arizona, the New York Times analyzed precinct data and determined that more than 80% of the 55,000 votes cast in the Arizona portion of the Navajo Nation went to President Biden. President Biden won Arizona by just 10,400 some votes. Can we say that Native Americans delivered Arizona for the Democrats? And if so, what should that party or both parties learn from the importance of the Native American vote in general?
Yeah, we can totally say that. We can also say a lot of things. I think it is, actually, for me, that wasn't a surprise, right? Like I said, in covering the Navajo Nation specifically, I learned back in the 2000s that Native Americans and specifically Navajos voted Democratic pretty strongly. The problem was that they've always been so gerrymandered with all these counties that vote Republican. So it's kind of the secret. One of the big projects that I worked on was analyzing specific results from precincts, and the Navajo Nation has like 110 voting districts. And when Obama won his first race, 108 of those districts went Democratic. But what was reported was that the whole Navajo Nation went red because all their surrounding communities had kind of overshadowed this result. So that makes perfect sense to me that the Navajo Nation, especially the Arizona part, went blue again, right? It's just, I think now that we have better tools to kind of analyze it and not just going by the overall county data, it's becoming more clear, and we're seeing that it's a lot more nuanced. And I frankly am quite proud of that turnout from my home tribe. And I do think that knowing what we know, or what we've learned in this most recent election, both parties can now recognize that it's not wise to ignore Native Americans, because I think it wasn't maybe not an intentional act of ignoring a population, but it was kind of dismissing us because we're such a small part of the population, right? Numbers wise, if you look at like the census data. But I think when we are personally affected, and I think the pandemic played a huge role in that turnout. Like, we saw firsthand exactly how we were affected by this terrible historic event, and yet the administration at the time was kind of trying to dismiss it and hide it and pretend it wasn't real. I think that hit people really hard on Indian country, and that helped incite this huge surge of voter turnout, and especially in the direction that it went.
Interesting. Marci, how did you see that play out in Montana? I mean, Montana, this last election went deep red, but I think that there was also increased voter participation from most Native American communities. What do you make of all that, or what do you know about how that data played out there in Montana?
Yeah, so you are right. Montana voters in our targeted precincts, which is not, like Jason said, it's not county level data, it's precinct level data. And we identify precincts that are mostly Native on all reservations, tribal nations, excuse me, except the CSKT tribal nation. We target precincts that are 70% or more Native. It's a little harder to do on the CSKT tribal nation because it's so checkerboarded, and so we have to go down a little bit there. But the turnout did increase again, to historic levels, even though we had vote by mail. We had a pandemic, and during the election was when the pandemic was peaking in our tribal nations. We were losing family members. The Northern Cheyenne Nation, I think it was right around that time where they lost like at least one person a day for 18 days. So having conversations with my mentors and allies, it's like every vote in Indian country should have counted for 2 votes because of how hard Natives people living in those precincts had to work to ensure their ballot was cast. Lauri alluded to the postal system, or the mail system of the mail issue, excuse me. on our tribal nations. We only get our mail, most of our residents only get their mail to a post office box. We don't get it delivered right outside our house, you know, as we do in Billings, Missoula, Great Falls, and other areas. So it's a trip to get the mail. Oftentimes several family members share a mailbox, a post office box. And so that, you know, there had to, a lot of resources and a lot of time and energy went into ensuring that every Native who wanted to vote was able to vote. And I'm sure we still left some out, right? But, you know, it was good. I mean, I think the part of, you know, Montana being deep red right now, it's, you know, we're going to see the suffer the consequences of that here, I would say, in the next couple years. But I think part of it is like trying to find that common ground and put partisanship beyond and aside as we find out who are we as Montanans. How are we trying to work together to make Montana a better place? Like it was in 2000, gosh, I might have the year wrong. Was it 19 when all of those Office of Public Assistance houses and the mental health funding was cut? And those were up on the High Line in rural Montana. That's who suffered the most when, you know, when politics have their own way. We everyday Montanans are the ones who suffer from the political upheaval. But, you know, we just got to keep showing up. What do we have to lose if we do show up? You know, that's what I keep telling people when, you know, when we lose an election like we did this last time. People are like, well, you know, you told me my vote counted. It doesn't matter. I voted, and look, we still ended up, you know, with people in there who don't represent our values. You know, so it's just part of like remembering to continue to show up and letting our folks know that we just got to keep showing up. And now that they're representing us, let's hold them accountable. And that's the other part of it. Like, I like to make sure that we're talking about this beyond voting. Like, it's before voting, it's after voting, it's all that stuff in the middle that is really important as well. And having those conversations, some folks, you know, will listen to us. You know, I like to mention Senator Jason Small from the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Nation. You know, he has conversations, and a lot of the times, you know, he'll vote his values and not his party. Although, you know, we do all know that there's things that go on behind there too. But it's folks like him, like I try to find common ground with, and other folks that are, I'm not Democrat, but I'm a little more progressive than a lot of folks, but I'm also a little more conservative. So it's like, we as Natives, I don't think we vote party, we vote values, we vote issues. And I would also say, you know, neither political party is for Native Americans. We are for ourselves. And we don't, like Jason was saying, you know, we show up liberal, but sometimes often have very conservative ideations and ideals, right? And so it's like, you know, we just got to show up and vote for who best represents us and will help ensure our voice is heard. So that we can find the common ground.
Yeah. I have more questions about the whole mixture of what you were just alluding to, but I'm going to interrupt myself for a minute to ask a question to the audience to respond to in the chat, which is, when you were a student, I'm talking like elementary school, middle school, high school, what, if anything, did you learn about the struggle for Native American voting rights in the United States? Was that anything that you remember getting any instruction on? And if so, what did you learn? I'll speak for myself and say I feel like I did get an education on, to some extent, it was probably fairly superficial, but on Black civil rights and voting rights, and a little bit on women's voting rights. But I don't actually think that it was ever pulled out as a topic in my entire pre-college education, which is pretty awful. And I don't know if that was just I'm kind of asking therefore out of my own curiosity of how unique that was for me, but also because I think that in general, all the activism and the work and the struggle that Native American people did to achieve the right to vote is somehow not as integrated into the whole like American story. And that seemed, but yeah, I'm curious to hear your reactions in the chat. But just picking up where we left off, you know, no group of people is a monolith. And of course that applies to Native Americans as well. And within every family, within every tribe, there's diversity of opinion, and of course among Native Americans as a whole. And that's already come up a couple of times here. And I guess I'm just wondering about how that intersects with efforts to, you know, grow the pipeline of Native American leaders, and also to like deepen the processes that are allowing people to exercise their right to vote, because unfortunately some of those things have become really politicized, and in terms of like they've been made partisan. And so do you see people on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican, working to empower Native American leaders and to increase voting on reservations or just among Native Americans wherever they live? And that's just a question for any or all of you.
This is Lauri. I definitely see the rise in both parties, and that's just simply because, and I think that's absolutely commendable, knowing that we can finally stand at the forefront on an even keel. It signifies that we are not limited to one side in party lines, but rather understandably diversified in our views and differences. As a grassroots trench worker, I was not very attuned to what goes on levels of policy making or law passing. So, you know, my knowledge is a little limited when it comes to that, but I was merely assisting my people in providing a service. But eventually I did notice that I grew a passion for what I was doing. And I was asked to extend my work a little bit with legislation. So I've gone to legislation, I think 16 times, speaking on behalf of Native issues, whether it's tribal sovereignty, missing murdered Indigenous people. You know, what I really felt passionate about definitely was just simply because I was working hard through heat, masks, snowstorms, knocking doors, you know. I definitely found a passion that required me to not be quiet and go to legislation and speak on as an opponent on I think it was like 5 bills: House Bill 176, 406, 455, and Senate Bills 4, 169, and 170. I was standing in opposition because they were all bills that came to the table that wanted to continue voter suppression. There was everything from Let's Stop, I think it was, what was her name? Lola Galloway, or, you know, she was one of the representatives with House Bill 455 who wanted to completely do away with mail-out ballots to post office boxes. And if that is not some voter suppression, I don't know what else is. Another one that, you know, really baffled me was that, you know, Marci had mentioned it before, is that there's such a issue to try to come from rural locations into simple places of business to obtain a identification card. We only have one location, and that was in Bighorn County, to be able to get an ID. And my own personal experience was I had to wait 3 months to even get an ID in Bighorn County. So imagine people who are living in rural Montana who have issues with, one, lack of employment, lack of transportation, you know, like those issues that are real people face in Montana, especially during a pandemic when we're losing jobs anyway. Our economy's at an all-time low within our own areas, and it's just heartbreaking to see that these are actual bills that come to the table, and they're like, you know, yeah, it's important that, you know, you need to come in person to simply register to vote, and please have your valid ID. Yeah, that's not very probable, you know, considering where we're at. And so, you know, I definitely felt that passion as a grassroots worker, as a trench worker, you know, blood, sweat, tears, knowing exactly what the issues are. And we have high risk people, we have the elderly that we are concerned for. So, you know, I definitely stood in opposition. And then I'm very thankful. I'd like to mention Sharon Paraguay, representative, who brought, I think it was House Bill 613, revising the voter laws for Native American locations. And I really am, I commend her for that, because we had a great turnout for proponents. I think we had 43, 25 who spoke and 18 who wrote in, and only 3 opponents on that one. And so, you know, I just have to say that I am growing in this work, and I'm so grateful and passionate about what we need to do and continue to do. And definitely, as Marci had mentioned before, I think the biggest thing that has been beneficial and helpful for us has been working as a collective with the different groups that are coming to the forefront. And, you know, there's strength in numbers. So I hope we continue to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Jason, I wonder if you have thoughts. You said right at the beginning this this idea that a lot of Native people maybe vote more liberal, but there's maybe more conservative at home. Can you say more about what you mean by that and how that intersects with this question of partisanship and development of Native American voting rights?
Yeah. And I think it kind of makes sense if you think about it, like, especially when we're talking about Native Americans that live on reservations. Reservations are so rural, so they kind of like share a lot of, they have a lot in common with small towns, and small towns tend to be more conservative, right? Back at home, we're just talking about the Navajo Nation being consistently Democratic in its elections, right? But it's also, I think, one of the only, if not the only place that has still outlawed gay marriage, where the tribal council like took it upon itself to outlaw gay marriage, and I don't know of any other place in the country that still hasn't removed that or addressed it, and it's still in the books there. So that's a clear example of what I'm talking about, and I think. Yeah, partisanship on Indian countries, I think we might see a lot more of that. I'm kind of hoping not, but I think there's been such a big spotlight on federal races, especially during the Trump. Also, we had Obama first, and he was kind of like this big light for a lot of, especially Native Americans, because he had that, like, he invited Native leaders to come and talk with him and his administrators every year, right? And in these consortiums, which were really awesome. And as far as I could find, the only time that a president has done that consistently year after year for 8 solid years in a row, right? And so that gave a lot of people a lot of hope. Trump had a similar reaction, but in the opposite way, where he angered a lot of people. So I think my point is, a lot of Native Americans are really focused on politics right now more than ever so before, and might pick up that, like, bipartisan system because of that. I'm kind of hoping not, but it kind of feels like it's inevitable, at least in like the outside reservation races. I did see a lot more like partisan posts and my social media and my news feeds from Native Americans, like people who are being pandered to or being courted by like specific offices. In Arizona, the GOP has been trying to court Native American candidates to win more state seats for at least 4 years, and they've been very active with that. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming years.
Interesting. I'm wondering about some of the differentiating factors among Native American communities, among Native American voters in terms of political involvement, like demographically, like are younger people maybe especially in Montana, younger Native people more likely to vote, or older people, or do we know that? And yeah, just how within Native American communities, how voter turnout breaks down.
So I know we haven't, at least for Montana Native Vote, we haven't done that breakdown yet for age, but we will be doing that to see what that age breakdown is. I know, like, as far as like the Facebook following, most of the followers are women, and they're 35 and older. So that kind of shows, you know, who's sort of paying attention, at least on that platform. Of course, you know, like the younger people are more on Instagram and Snapchat anyways, and they're not so much on Facebook. So I don't know, you can probably just take that with a grain of salt, but nonetheless, that is how the organization reaches a lot of folks. It's one of the, you know, the strongest tools that we have in our toolbox. But I would also like to add to like the what Jason was saying, you know, the conservatism. Another thing is the abortion rights, right? And I think people, us as natives, value life in a way. And I know some of our elected officials who are native struggle with voting on those pro-choice bills, if you will, where I think it's like pro stay out of my pants or whatever, you know, vote, is how I see it. So that is like, I think another way that we see the separation in our native communities. And I think like the more we educate, another project I'm working on is educating people in native communities. For instance, the like Planned Parenthood, it's not just about abortion, right? It's about healthcare, it's about family planning. It's about me having a say over my family, when I want to start it and how I want to start it and who I want to start it with. In addition to like the same-sex marriages and stuff. But I think also what we're seeing in our communities is, at least in my tribal nation, when we're reconnecting to our traditional ways, Two-Spirit people are not, you know, the odd ones or the taboo ones. In fact, we are the ones who were looked at and revered, and oftentimes the medicine people and the leaders. And so, at least in my community, not everybody, there's still the homophobes there and all that stuff, but we're starting to, some of us are starting to reconnect to this homophobia is really comes from colonization and settlerism, right? It's not my tribe, it's not the way that we were. I think another thing that pushes folks to kind of move a little to the right is gun ownership. So again, being misinformed, like, oh, I'm not going to own a gun if Democrats take control. Well, quite frankly, that's not true, right? I'm a proud gun owner myself. And, you know, but I do think that that is another issue that divides us politically. You know, and then also the extraction of fossil fuels. That's another issue that kind of pushes some either to the right or to the left, if you look at it politically. But also, you know, understanding the complexities in our tribal nations, very high poverty, you know, and some folks are willing to take that money and sacrifice the land and the water, you know, because like in Northern Cheyenne, they have, I think, like the highest quality air in a certain region or something. So like, you know, they're really doing what they can to protect that. And I think there's still folks trying to extract the fossil fuels from there. So I think there's like a lot of issues that still separate us. Again, like you mentioned, we're not monolithic, and I don't think any or many sets of humans are monolithic, which is the great thing, right? I think, but so that I forgot what the question you asked was, but I just wanted to add to like the part of like what kind of separates us, because on all of those issues that I just mentioned, like some of them might go to the right and some might go to the left, and you know, it's just it's interesting to sit down and have conversations with folks who have different views than we do, and I do.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from all of you is, in a way, that a lot of Native American communities could very well be characterized as swing voters. And that does make me feel like what you said, Jason, like, look out, they're coming for you, because everybody wants those swing voters. I would love to get some questions from the audience. And I also want to just ask another one for you to think on while Sam pulls some questions out of the chat, which is, who is your pick for our first Native American president of the United States? And you are free to nominate one of our panelists today. Sam, do you want to bring out some of the questions or feedback from the chat?
Yeah, so earlier in the conversation, Jeanette asked, she said, "This is such important work, thank you. My question is, what is being done and what can we all do to help hold elected officials accountable so that people can feel confident that their vote matters?"
That is such a good question. And I think if I had like a really good answer for that, I'd be a very rich man. I think the answer to that is it's kind of fix politics and fix our government. I do believe that I think, like I said earlier, you know, like seeing actions like what's happening with Miss Halland right now, that she's looks like she's going to get this confirmation, which is one thing, but I think that the road leading up to it, this slow, like argumentative process that she had to go through, and that she's still like, you know, standing tall, and she's still like unfazed by it. Those kind of things are going to help people see that like my vote had this outcome, like it has a very visual deliverable that happened. um I think the more that we can connect like the end result to the vote is probably the best way to do that. But like I said, because everything else that everyone else has tried in the past didn't work, people are still disenfranchised. But I think that's changing now, that we can see a very direct change that happened pretty quickly if you compared November to now, right? And we're now in this historic moment.
And I just like to add to that, as part of um, thinking about this beyond just voting. It's like when you ask what can be done, like, well, first and most immediately, contact your state legislator and tell them to support not only maintaining our access to voting as it is, but expanding and really looking to make the services equitable, not just equal, but equitable. That is something like on the policy level, but I also think like on more of a long-term personal community level. Support Native candidates, donate to them, let them know that you appreciate them, let them know that you, even if they're on the opposite side of the political spectrum, let them know that, you know, that you're seeing them, you're hearing them. And also like have conversations for non-natives, have conversations in your communities about Native Americans. So let's try to take down that racial discrimination and that racial tension, especially, you know, thinking about our state of Montana. That I think would really help you know, at least take down some of those barriers. We're not going to do it in my lifetime. We're not going to see, you know, a completely equitable playing field. Well, maybe, but I doubt it. Completely equitable playing field as far as voting access. But I think if we think about this, like beyond, I always like to push folks to think beyond voting and think about what are we doing to make Montana a better place. And, you know, that might help. And it's beyond the policies, it's beyond the politics. We have to heal from historical trauma in our communities. What I say, we can make all the policies and politics we want, but if we as Native Americans aren't creating and holding space for us to heal from what we carry behind us and what we carry in our DNA, then we're going to be we're going to have less energy and time to invest in the things that are happening here and now. Lauri alluded to it, like some of us are in survival mode. I'm not me, but at one point in time, and I have family members who have to decide between putting a $20 card on my electricity box or going and buying diapers or milk or bread or something to that effect, right? And when we're in those situations, voting is the last thing I'm going to have a conversation about, right? We have all the you know, the addictions and all that stuff in our community. So like always remember to think beyond just voting. Think about who we are. We're human beings. You know, we have a history and a past, and we want to have equal access to opportunity just like everybody else. And I will say, I keep meaning to say this, but keep forgetting, is that Montana is the only state that has parity representation in the Montana state, or in the state legislature. So we have, I believe it's 11 Native Americans in our state legislature. We're the only state in the United States that can say that. Well, that has significant Native population. I guess those that have, you know, zero, whatever. So that's something to be proud of Montanans. And that is because people like Janine Pease fought for, you know, voting rights, stopping the voter dilution with the gerrymandering and stuff back in the 80s, right? And then people continue to fight for it. We have redistricting coming up here this year. And so making sure that, you know, part of what y'all can do to help make sure that voting is something that we can keep doing as Natives, and that our vote continues to matter, is make sure you're finding out, you know, from groups such as Montana Native Vote and Forward Montana, Western Native Voice, Montana Women's Vote, and other folks like that, that are going to be working on, some ways to ensure that gerrymandering isn't happening in this next redistricting session. So to ensure that we maintain our Native majority House and Senate seats that are on and near our tribal nations, because I think having that Native American caucus in our state legislature is really critical to us advancing bills such as the one that Representative Stuart Paraguay just presented. And I was going to say too, there was another question about like, what are either side doing to advance Native voting rights. I haven't really seen a non-Native from either side come out like Sharon Paraguay did for our voting rights. And so until we see the non-Natives coming and showing up with the fierce passion and commitment that she showed up with, I can't say that Republicans nor Democrats are working hard to expand our voting rights.
Interesting. And I just would really, I feel like it'd be really remiss if our time went by and without at least a brief touch on the really important lawsuit that you were a part of, Marci, which I think is also part of the story that you were just telling, which was Western Native Voice v. Stapleton. And it was all centered around the Montana Ballot Interference Prevention Act, BIPA. I know we want to get to more audience questions, but can you just give us a real quick 101 on this? Because I feel like everyone needs to know what it was and what happened with it.
Sure. So BIPA restricted the number of ballots any one Montanan can pick up to 6. That's including your own ballot. And you had to sign these forms, and you had to keep all this documentation. And keeping in mind, we're rural, reservations are. And so some people just pick up family members' ballots and drop them off. And we've never had to sign anything before. There's never been any allegations or election fraud found in Montana. And so that's, wait, I think something's going on. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, cool. So there's some background noise. Hopefully you can't hear it. So we, along with ACLU, Montana Native Vote, Western Native Voice, and 5 tribes filed a lawsuit against the state to show that was an infringement and disenfranchised Native Americans in our state. And so we were successful, and we were victorious, and we maintained that access and that right to pick a ballot in this last election. However, there are still bills coming up. There are almost every legislative session that I've worked in, since 2013. So every session we see some other bill come up that, whether it's intentional or not, does have negative consequences on voting rights for Native Americans. And we talk about, like, I've seen a post kind of pop through on the bottom there about there's other towns that have PO boxes only, and other towns that have to travel too. The thing, and also this conversation goes to broadband access as well. Rural America does all have similar consequences and similar situations. However, when you look at the high unemployment rate and the high poverty rate on our tribal nations, that's what makes these barriers extra, what would you say, double down, or, extra
high impact.
Yeah, high impact on our communities as opposed to other communities. I'm not saying that other communities are poverty free and free of all the negative things that we have on our tribal nations, but because as a whole we have such high access to unemployment, we have higher just all the barriers. So when you look at all of those things, then you look at the compilation of them, and that's how there seems to be a higher impact on our communities than others.
Yeah, everybody's not starting in the same place, and there's a whole legacy of white advantage there that is that even if you have to travel from a small town Montana and you're white to cast your ballot, it's a different starting point than for a Native American person in most cases. Yeah, well, let's get back to more questions from the chat. I'm so curious what's going on there.
There are a couple kind of related questions on the same topic. Linda said, in the 2000, Senator Carol Juneau argued that vote by mail did not work in Indian country. And she asked, has that changed? What are the panelists' thoughts? And then earlier, Carla said, how can we counter the argument that voting by mail is inherently fraudulent? So there's a lot of question about mailing your ballots in.
Okay, so I guess just from my stance and my perspective with the work I've been doing, it actually mail out ballots have been the only saving grace for our communities because like Marci had mentioned before, there are multiple families that actually have their mail sent to one box location. For example, myself, I am I have like, let's see, I think there's seven adults in my family who all have their mail sent to the same box. And so, you know, it's what helped in this election season. I can't say for previous, I can't say for future, but it has been the saving grace, you know, especially if you have an accountable adult who is collecting that mail and distributing it the way it needs to be distributed. However, you know, of course, there's going to be some issues with that, with mail not getting to the people, to the family members at the right amount of time. But, you know, if you have people like us, you know, at the forefront who can actually this year, well, that I know of, the Secretary of State had the website to be able to end the reach option where you could actually see the active voter status and where the mail out ballot went. And if you intercepted it in a decent amount of time, you were able to contact the elections office and have them resend the ballot to the proper mailbox. And I honestly, I know there's a very, very, very low number of people who are, you know, fraudulently casting ballots. Actually, that's not even an issue. So, you know, I don't see any problem with that. But yeah, I think it's important from my perspective, from the work that I did and what my knowledge base, that we have the mail out ballot distribution. It's very important.
So I'll just follow up on that, on the where it is problematic, the vote by mail. And there's several studies out there to back this up, or not to back up what I'm going to say, but to back up that it is problematic for Native communities. I can't remember them. If I remember, Randy or Samantha, I'll share the research with y'all. But you think of housing, we have lack of adequate housing and enough housing on our tribal nations, which leads to the fact, like Lauri, multiple families and multiple adults sharing one ballot box. We don't all have responsible folks like Lauri sharing a post office box with her, so we don't always get our mail. To get a replacement ballot pre-COVID, outside of COVID, you had to go there and get it, go to the county seat and get it. So that adds a problem. And also, not everybody has a stamp laying around. Pre-COVID, you had to have a stamp, right? And so there's all these things that were in place before COVID and will come back after COVID. So I've always, and then the mailing part of it, like when we register to vote, we use our physical address and we don't always put our post office box on there, right? Because we don't all have a mailing address. Some of folks living on our tribal nations get their mail delivered. Literally, it says general delivery, you know, Browning, Montana, 59417. And the postmaster person, you know, sets them aside and the folk will come up and say, do I have any mail? And they'll go look in the general delivery part of it. So that's another problem. So it's more connected to the housing part of it and the postal delivery systems. We have limited postal office hours on our tribal nations, and it's also sometimes farther away from other places. And so when you think about that time, that distance, again, to travel to the post office to check your mail, to remember to bring that piece of mail back to it. So it's multiple facets to the one part of why it's shown in a lot of research that postal or that vote by mail is not at this point, it's not a conducive way to have our elections outside of COVID times. But I will say, you know, we back in gosh, I don't remember the year, we went and visited Portland, and they vote by mail. And so like there are systems and there is a way to make this work in our communities. But the first thing that we need is we need a election office in our tribal nations, 8 to 5, all 25 days, and not just 3 hours here, 4 hours there, 3 hours there. So that is one way where, because, you know, folks are going to it's voter modernization is happening, automatic voter registration, online voter registration, vote by mail, right? We see a lot of folks moving that way. And so my thing is making sure when our allies push for those types of things that and that we are all here. But for me, it's been a passion to make sure they think about the negative consequences that come from voter modernization for other folks, but maybe not living on our tribal nations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have another couple of questions I could easily go to, but Sam, are there more questions in the chat? Because I don't want to take up space from listeners who might want to ask things.
There have been more questions in the chat and some really good conversations and ideas in there. I think that most of them have been touched on in pieces though. So I think if you want to take these last couple of minutes to just have one wrap up question, that would be wonderful.
Okay, great. Well, this is sort of about a specific thing. So in some ways, I'm not sure that it's the ideal wrap up question, but I'll ask it anyway. We can just go full content all the way to the end here. And that is, I just wanted to think about the effect of some of the protests that have gotten nationwide attention in the last several years, especially like the DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, the Keystone XL pipeline protests. And it feels like there's, I actually saw some things in national media, especially during Dakota Access, that it was kind of shockingly out of touch, like people from states that don't have strong Native American populations almost being like, oh, wow, there are still Native Americans in our country. And it's like, and so that kind of really irritating ignorance aside, I do think that there's a way that a lot of non-Native people have become more aware of Native Americans as a political force and as different voting blocks. And I just kind of wanted to get all of your take on that. Like, do you see that as a good thing? How do you think that the protests that have been happening are affecting Native American political participation overall?
I can talk about that for a little bit. I do think so. Like I think tribal politics or political issues on especially in Indian country always seems to start at the grassroots level. It's always like people who are really driven. And as part of everything that we've been talking about, right? Because you kind of feel disenfranchised from outside issues, and you kind of don't really feel like you're a part of the big government system. So when something happens to you directly, for the longest time, nobody was listening to us on Indian country. They weren't really paying attention to us outside of lip service. So that's a lot of Native communities taken to like physical action, like marches and protests. I think these are healthy, but they're also the results of like just months, if not years, of feeling not listened to and disregarded or dismissed, and so then it kind of blows up into all these things. And I think the end result is like this kind of new-ish stereotype of how Native Americans are always fighting against the government, right? They're always protesting, and I think that's an unfortunate view to have, because it suggests you don't understand the context, which is that the reason why they're fighting, or the reason why they're protesting, is because nobody listened to them for so long, right? Especially in the case of Standing Rock and DAPL, that was the direct result of the bureaucratic process failing and not listening to the concerns of the tribes. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the exact same thing. There's been talk about this for years and years and years, until finally people got so tired of not being heard about this issue that now there's this huge phenomenal push to make sure everybody knows that it's happening and to please pay attention to this, right? But I think, yeah, so that this new spotlight comes with that, like, if you don't have the context, it's like, why are they always protesting? Why can't they just participate, right? But they have been, you just haven't been listening.
Well, I learned so much from this conversation and I'm so grateful for it. And I guess I just want to nominate all of you for first Native American president. So, and really just appreciate your thoughtfulness and your willingness to be here and lead this conversation today. So thank you so much. And I'll hand it back to Sam and Humanities Montana staff.
Thank you, Amy. I just want to say again how grateful we are to all of our panelists, Lauri, Marci, and Jason, and to Amy for moderating, and to this wonderful audience who's stuck with us and had such a great conversation and questions in the chat. We would love to hear your feedback. If you could take a few minutes to fill out the survey that Ryan is about to put in the chat there. And I'd also like to thank Emily Niles for live captioning this event to make it more accessible for everyone. I hope you can join us for the final panel in the Why It Matters series. We've got one more coming up on April 7th. It is the political power of young people. And we have the panelist Kirsten Iwe from Forward, Montana, which you've heard that a few times tonight. Tajin Perez from Western Native Voice. Samantha Francine, who is a young activist up in Flathead Valley, and Taylor Wilmarth, who is a high school journalist from Great Falls. So that's going to be another awesome conversation. I hope you can join us for that one as well. Finally, if you were moved by this conversation and would like to help support future programs like this, please consider donating to Humanities Montana. We truly appreciate the support that the Montana community shows in bringing the humanities into our daily lives. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.